Today on Locked On Red Wings, breaking down Steve Yzerman's free agency media availability.
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I'm previously of 97 Won the Ticket, where Scotty's the host over at Locked On Tigers and a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Also want to thank you guys for making Locked On Red Wings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Scotty, so our last episode where we talk about is this team any better keeps getting pushed back because more and more stuff keeps happening. And I want to talk about the media availability that Steve Yzerman did on the 4th of July. Because, of course, why would he take a day off on a national holiday? Of course. Why would
he's Canadian.
That's a solid point. He's Canadian. What does he give a give? But before we get to that, we got to make note that Joe Veleno has elected to go to arbitration as the two sides.
Really noteworthy. Like, I feel like that's just kind of like swept under the rug given where, we're at in the offseason and everyone's waiting on Raymond Insider, but I really do feel like that's a big piece of news that there is stuff to talk about with that.
Yeah, so he actually took a pay cut going into this last season.
Yeah, we talked about it. I remember the conversation on the show. We were like, yeah, he was not very good 2 seasons ago. Like, it's not shocking that he did take the pay cut. And then he had the really, really hot first half of the year where he looked like maybe kind of an established bottom 6, maybe even center. And then the second half kind of was in and out and a little bit more inconsistent again.
Yeah, so his his last contract rather was a 3-year entry-level contract to the Detroit Red Wings that had an AAV of $1.2 million. And then after just not developing quite as fast as we had hoped, he took a pay cut down to $825,000. I've seen some projections having him make as high as $2 million, which I when it comes to salary projections, I know as much as the next person, right? Like, it's all lost on me. It's all foreign to me. But $2 million feels like a lot for Joe Veleno's 28 points last year. But I could be wrong. If I had to guesstimate, I'd say he'd go back to like 1.125. But again, that's just gut. So it is not surprising he filed for arbitration because I'm sure Joe Veleno believes that he's worth more. I'm really curious if it's term that's the hang up or if it's money that's the hang up.
Yeah, well, if it's arbitration, that would lead me to believe it's money because there's no way he's expecting term, right? And arbitration is going to be a 1-year deal anyway. So to me, that almost kind of assures that it's money. But I think the interesting part of this is how the Wings view Veleno, right? Like, they are clearly willing to extend RFAs that are arbitration eligible, but Joe Veleno is not one of those players. They would rather now. There's nothing that says he files for arbitration and then they sign him to work out a 1-year deal, whatever, between now and whenever. But like it's really interesting to me how I think this is more telling of kind of how the front office views Veleno, where he's more of a year-to-year kind of evaluation caliber of player rather than somebody that they're like, we want to guarantee lock him up longer term, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody. It's just like, this is the first time, maybe last year was honestly the first time, but it's always, listen to what the organization says, right? Like the moves that the front office will make or does make will tell you everything you need to know about the standing of a player. And I think that, to me, that's my biggest takeaway from it.
Yeah. In the end, I'm not overly concerned, and we don't need to make this a longer conversation than it is. Like, a deal's going to get done.
They'll settle on something, right? Or they'll either get a deal done, or again, they'll go to arbitration and, and whatnot. It's just, it's just, I think that's more of a signifier that they view Veleno as, every year we're going to reevaluate whether we want him back rather than, let's lock him up long term, which he's an RFA in the bottom 6. That makes sense.
Yeah, sure. And on top of that too is like you mentioned it just there, like he's filing for arbitration, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go to arbitration. They can still settle on a contract before that happens. But if they do go to arbitration, that would open up a second buyout window. And this is where actually I learned something new. I think it was Max Bultman of The Athletic who tweeted it out on a separate tweet. But he pointed out that only players who make more than $4 million are eligible for the second buyout window. And if I'm looking at this roster and players who make over $4 million, there's only one player worth buying out just based on term alone, and that would be Ville Husso, because I'm not buying out Andrew Kopp and paying him for another 6 years.
Right.
Like that's no way, shape, or form am I doing that. And so, like, fan favorite options for buyout would be like Justin Hold. He's not eligible because he doesn't make $4 million. So that was really interesting to learn, but also it really just means that it really reaffirms rather that I don't think that they're going to buy anyone out in this window, because there's nobody who makes $4 million that has fewest enough or as little enough term to make it worth buying out.
Yeah.
So,
no, absolutely.
All right. Well, with that, Scotty, if you agree with me on that take, then let's move on to the Yzerman presser. He spoke on the 4th of July, and we're just now getting to it because, again, we recorded before that, our little 4th of July episode for you guys. And, Scotty, I just want to ask, what was the biggest thing that stood out to you, or the first thing I should say that stood out to you about this presser?
Yeah, Yzerman is very good at press conferences. It's really fascinating how he doesn't give too much away. Like, the Wings organization holds information very close to their chest, but he's also weirdly honest as well. Like, he's also like pretty upfront. Like, when you ask him questions, like he has no issue being very honest. I think there's a couple of things that jump out, and I'm sure we'll talk about all of them. Obviously, that people were asking questions about Raymond and Seider and whatnot, but I think the most interesting one that really jumped out to me was somebody had asked him post Wallman trade if that was to clear up cap for a specific move, or if he was having conversations early in the day on Monday, right when free agency opened, and his response was there was one specific player that they were making a run at, and they had, like a lot of talks with, and they had negotiations with, and then it just didn't go their way, and they weren't willing to go as high as the contract ended up being. And then all the room, people, I think it's probably Stammer. I think that just makes the most sense, right? Like that was somebody that the Wings were linked to. And at the end of the day, he's an older player that got a decent amount of term, and Yzerman notoriously doesn't like giving term to anybody. Nonetheless, somebody who's Stamkos's age. I know it looks like you want to talk, but that's pretty much it. Like, that was the biggest thing that really jumped out at me, was him admitting, like, yeah, we were really close and made a pretty deep run on one specific player that we didn't end up getting. And but he also did say that they had a lot of conversations with the people that they did get prior. It wasn't like anybody was a consolation prize. So,
no, I completely agree with you. I mean, in terms of like your assessment of that and your interpretation, that I also agree that it was probably Steven Stamkos. Again, that's just our speculation. It could have also been like a trade and then signed for Jake Gensel. Because they were also linked to that. But just thinking about like his comments, the words he used specifically was it was going to take too much surgery to make it work. And then when you think about the Tarasenko sign, right? That to make the Tarasenko signing work and then still have room left to sign all the RFAs, they had to move out Robbie Fabry. So that's why, to me, the Stamkos thing makes sense, because Stamkos signed, what, a 4x8 is $8 million a year.
Yeah.
So when he says too much surgery, I would imagine and this is my speculation and I'm interpreting. He didn't say this explicitly, but I would imagine what he meant by that was it would take too much work to offload enough money to bring Stamkos in, while also making other, valuable moves on free agency. Because he said, like, July 1st happens so fast, like it's bang, 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 and next thing you know, all the players are gone. So you can't spend too much time worrying about one player, because if you do, you're going to miss out on all the rest of them. Right. And he very nearly did for the most part.
Yeah.
So
thank goodness there was a really decent straggler there.
Yeah. But I agree with you. I think that it was the most interesting thing that he said. That's probably the most candid he's ever been about a lot of things, right? Where he tells you, like, there was a guy that we in particular were going after, and we just couldn't swing it with how much he wanted. Which brings me to another thing, too. That's something we have been saying that Yzerman actually confirmed during the media availability as well in regards to term, and I will tell you what that is in segment 2 of Locked On Red Wings. Got to talk to you guys today about FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much, I just never want them to stop. But the Stanley Cup Finals are over, and all we got left is baseball. But hey, those Tigers, they just committed their first sweep since the first opening series of the season. So hey, Tarek Skubal, career high 13 strikeouts. Scotty's living life right now after this weekend. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty and I are talking about the Steve Yzerman presser, and I just wanted to go to here because it just felt like a natural place to go. You know, he mentioned that there were obviously players that they had interest on going into free agency and guys they thought would be a good fit for the direction they want to take this team. But he was shocked by the amount of money and particularly term handed out to what he called, and he this is the word he used, role players. And that is, I don't want to, I'm not coming on here to, this isn't pat yourself on the back podcast, but like it was so obvious.
Locked on Pat Brian on the back.
Yeah, Locked On Pat Bryant on the back podcast.
Somebody make a graphic, baby. Let's run it.
It seemed so obvious, though, right? Like when you saw these terms handed out 6-7 years to guys who are, second pairing, third pairing, or third liners, second liners at best. It didn't make a lot of sense, especially because he notoriously doesn't like to give out term, and we are already criticizing Yzerman over some of the term he's giving out to guys of the same caliber that are on shorter deals. Can you imagine if we went out there, I'm not the Red Wings. Can you imagine if the Red Wings went out there and signed an Andrew Kopp-esque player to a 7-year deal this offseason? Like, the pushback would be insane. So when I heard him say that, I was like, yep, Steve, that makes sense, and that was probably the smart thing to do for the long-term outlook of this team and the cap situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that again, him being very open and upfront and honest there, I always appreciate about his pressers. But that is obviously something you definitely brought up right after, and I think that it is that's a fair point to make. And we came on here and I cried and moaned about how they didn't add very much on Monday. But I still think that that's a very fair angle. It's very fair to say, look at the amount of money and or term that was getting thrown around to some of these players. Absolutely. Which again is even furthers my point of I really think it was Stamkos.
I agree.
If you read between the lines there and you look at the players that don't classify as role players, like he said, and are a lot closer to being worth what they got than some of the other players out there on the open market. I think it really kind of all roads point to that being the obvious candidate.
Well, and you too look at the acquisitions he did make, right? They're all in such good contracts, reasonable contracts. He didn't overpay for a single player. Cam Talbot, 2 years at 2.5. Eric Gustafsson, 2 years, $2 million. Patrick Kane, 1 year, $4 million with bonuses. Tarasenko, 1 year was at 4.75, or 2 years, 4.75 rather. Like Tyler Mott, 1 year, $800,000. Like all these guys are upgrades over guys that you lost in one way or another, and you got them for fair contracts on the open market. Were there better players out there than some of these guys? Absolutely, but you would have had to pay through the nose to get them. And that's a fair argument. If you want to say, you got to pay through the nose if you want to make the team better, that's fair. But this year with how insane it was, I am okay with maybe going.
Well,
maybe
and
not.
again, getting Tarasenko completely changes the outlook of,
Right.
the initial maybe gut reaction that I certainly had after Monday, right?
Well,
Like that, not that it was like a perfect offseason or this team is an 100-point team now or anything, but it certainly changes, the opinion going forward in the pulse after that was kind of low. I mean, there were people calling for Yzerman's head at one point even after kind of missing on everybody on Monday. So I do think that Tarasenko kind of single-handedly changes the outlook and it makes it a lot easier to say these things. We're like, oh yeah, of course you don't overpay, so-and-so. Like it's a lot easier to say that now because of the signing of Vlad.
Well, that actually brings me up to fantastic natural segue, Scotty, because that brings me naturally to this next point that Yzerman brought up, and it was something, again, we said on the Lost episode, which we'll probably dedicate a whole episode to now redoing that conversation now that they have Tarasenko. And Yzerman said that he believes that this team is as good as last year. That's what he said. He thinks this team is comparable to last year's team, and I do tend to agree with him. He says we lost goals, but we gained better defense. And he basically said what we were saying, where at what point does that even out, right? Like you're keeping more goals out of
We
your
said that
net.
on the Lost episode, by the way.
So there's nothing. Well, actually, I have it downloaded.
We had
I do have proof.
Great conversation. That was a great show. That was really a great show.
I do have proof. I just haven't posted it. It's in the archives.
It was a great show.
It's like, are they better enough defensively to make up for the goals they lost? Right. And I think the acquisition of Tarasenko, who puts goals in the back, pucks in the back of the net, puts goals up on the score sheet, does help to make that a more realistic conversation. I think the acquisition of Tarasenko, and this is veering into a different conversation here, but I do think the acquisition of Tarasenko does help to at least prevent this team from having a horrid slide. Like we were going into that episode that, again, the Lost episode. It's like it's going to go down in infamy now when it was just a normal conversation. But like we went into that conversation being like, they're marginally better at defense, but they've lost a lot of goals. I don't think it's going to – I think you're looking down the barrel of a slide because you have these rookies coming up and you need the rookies to come up, and we're beating the drum for the rookies to come up. But when you bring the rookies up, unless you have a Connor Bedard – or Moritz Seider and Lucas Raymond, but a lot of these guys aren't those players. Most of these guys aren't those caliber of players. You're going to expect bumps along the road, so they're going to slide next year. But I do think the Vladimir Tarasenko acquisition does help change that conversation to that. Now maybe if they do slide, it's by a few points. But, of course, that would still mean they miss the playoffs. And for a lot of fans, that's not acceptable. And I'm at a point now in the rebuild myself where I do understand how hard it is to rebuild in hockey. And I do understand Yzerman came in with nothing and that he got screwed on the lottery time and time again. But I can no longer tell fans if they're upset if the Red Wings missed the playoffs for a sixth year in Yzerman's tenure. I can't tell them to chill out. Like, I think they're warranted in that, but that doesn't mean I agree with that.
Yeah, well, it's also really interesting that the way that he described it was, locked on Pat Bryant on the back. Like, it was very similar to how we were talking about it in that episode, right? Like, this was he had mentioned, as you just alluded to there, that they had goals walk out the door, but then they also brought in defense. And he said that at one point he specifically said, they're around the same as last year's team, but they're very different than last year's team, right? Like that was a point he really tried to drive home, was like, this should be on paper a much more defensively sound and defensive minded team. And I also think that raises the floor. Does it raise the ceiling? Maybe not, but like it does, I think, prevent, as you said, maybe the big slides. Like teams that are glass cannons like that and don't play very good defense, don't have great goaltending, but score a lot of goals. You never know what you're going to get on a night-to-night basis, where the teams that are a little bit more defensively sound tend to be the teams that are really good regular season teams. And then the postseason, obviously anything can happen in hockey. So like, I do think that shifting, and obviously Lalonde's system we've talked about a lot, caters itself to being more defensive minded too. Like all of these points, I think are reasons for optimism. The reasons for pessimism are is the ceiling any higher though? Like, is there a chance that this team is any better? And I'm not sure you brought anybody in who can do that. I think the only route you really have to this team being better than last year is if your young core takes another step forward, right? If Raymond takes another, and Yzerman said this in the presser, right? He said there's a possibility that Raymond could take another step forward and be like the star they think he is. Seider can take another step forward. Obviously, he's going to be on power play 1 this year. That's going to be a huge change. Fully healthy seasons from Larkin, who knows? Maybe he can even flirt with like 85, 90 points. Like you have, and then he mentioned DeBrincat, right? Hopefully more goal scoring. He even mentioned DeBrincat's expected goals for percentage,
right.
And I smiled for Brian. But he mentioned that. He mentioned just expected goals. He mentioned his shot percentage and how they expect all of that to bounce back. Like, there are reasons that there are ways and routes for this team to get better. They're just all internal. And I think that is inherently a big risk, but also could be a big reward. It's both.
Right. I mean, go back to the end of season availability where he's like, this team's got to get better defensively. Like, that was very clearly a goal of his. And he mentioned, too, that, they might not score as many goals, but this team, he thinks the players that they got will have more clear roles on this team than some of the players did last year. Like, Tyler Mott's going to be a penalty kill guy. Like, there's not so much, like, you're going to have guys in the bottom 6 who provide a lot of goals, but they don't have a clear role on the team. So I think he had a goal in mind approaching free agency. I think he accomplished it. He wanted to get better defensively, and I think he did that for the most part, and also supplemented the youth with a good finishing top 6 forward in Vladimir Tarasenko. And of course, a full healthy season of Patrick Kane he mentioned. He's like, you're going to get a full season of Patrick Kane. And we kept talking about too, like he'll be able to train like an athlete, and he's looking forward to being able to do that. Also, Jonathan Berggren coming up. He expects both. He did explicitly say he expects Berggren and Albert Johansson to play a role, and that Berggren's gonna help supplement some of that scoring that they lost, and we've been saying that for months. Like, Berggren, if he's on the Red Wings come opening night, he basically fills Sprong's role as your depth power play goal scorer. Like, that's Jonathan Berggren to a T in the NHL, I think. So I think that there is a route for them to be better than last year, but it would also bank a lot on a lot of things going right. I think you're and we like to say that raise the floor or that floor ceiling saying a lot, but I think you're onto something. I think the floor of this team is better, but I think the ceiling might be lower. It's a question mark. It all depends on how the young guys play. It really does. Which, hey, could turn out great, could not, but
good. He talked about a lot of the youth and the prospects that are going to play too.
Youth movement had to come eventually. It had to happen eventually. Anyway, Scott, we got to get to another break. When we return, I had a couple more comments, I'm sure you do too, that we can break down from the Yzerman free agency availability. So stay tuned to segment 3 of Locked On Red Wings. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty, what else do you got for us regarding the Yzerman availability that caught your ear?
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, what I kind of talked about before the break was another talking point there. Talked about the youth, talked about Edvinsson specifically and how he's going to have a much more prominent role, obviously, than he did last season. At one point, I think Kasper's name was thrown out there either by Yzerman or by a beat writer. And so, yeah, and like he mentioned Johansson by name as well. It just, again, like continues to go with the conversation we've been talking about where like there's I think another reason why he wasn't willing to overpay or overterm for a guy that's going to be in the middle 6 is because he wants to give a look to a lot of these younger players. And that's going to be something that is really exciting about this season, but also, again, kind of like young players are hard to predict, right? Like, Did you hear that? Loud motorcycle that just went by my window.
I did not.
Oh, that's good. I have a good mic. But it's one of those things where, like, you know, Marco Kasper could be really good. He could be a really, really good rookie, be a productive player. He also could get off to a slow start. He could have ups and downs because, like, that's what rookies do. And you know, Carter Mazur, you know, in that he talked about Mazur a little bit as well. I don't know. I think hearing him talk about and kind of openly admit that a lot of these younger players are going to get looks at the NHL level early in the fall is pretty telling.
Yeah, absolutely. He also talked a lot about, I think it was Max that asked him about, can Gustafsson play the right side? Because that's a question we had too. He's listed just as a left side. I reached out to John Chick of Locked On New York Rangers, and he said he played left side. And Yzerman's response to that is, well, we'll see. Then he talked about how Albert Johansson can play right side. I think he even said Edvinsson can play right side. I'd have to double check and listen on that, so I might be wrong. But he definitely said Albert Johansson and Gustafsson will try out on right side and play right side at some point, but that's ultimately on. He did say that's ultimately on Derek Lalonde to decide what's best. But I mean, I think that goes into the conversation we've been having too. Like this roster, this could be the roster. Right? And he did say he has not ruled out making another move via like trade, but there's nothing on his radar right now. But, I was texting you the other day, I think, or could have also been on the Lost episode. We had this conversation at some point. I can't remember what it was. But I'm like looking at the roster and like, yeah, it looks weird, but it also is possible because if you sign your RFAs, you'll have 12 forwards, 8D, because again, Lagesson is going to probably be in the AHL, so you'll have 8D and 3 goalies, because again, Jack Campbell's probably going to go to Grand Rapids as well. That's 23 players. At first, you're like, that's weird. Why would they not carry a 13th forward? Because most teams carry 2D, or 2 goalies rather, 7 or 8D, and then 13 forwards. Why would they not carry a 13th? But then you remember, oh yeah, Derek Lalonde likes running 11 and 7. So he doesn't necessarily need to carry a 13.
No issue doing 11-7, yeah.
And then Yzerman basically borderline stops just short of confirming that one of these left-handed D-men is going to play the right side. So that knocks that question out of, is Justin Holl immediately back in the lineup?
Right.
So, like, you're looking at a situation here where he could make another move. Nothing's reportedly on his radar, but, he doesn't tell anyone anything. The Red Wings break their own news half the time. It's crazy. Elliot Friedman's the most plugged-in insider in the sport. Nobody had Tarasenko going to the Red Wings. Yeah. They just broke it. So, like, you're looking at a situation here like this actually literally might be the roster once all the remaining, 3 RFAs get signed, 4 RFAs get signed. It's possible. It's really unorthodox, but it's looking like it might be more and more of a reality.
Yeah, especially as those, trade pieces that were talked about on the market go, those talks get quieter and quieter, or they just get completed and the trades go through and the Wings are on the sidelines with them. It does. I still think there's a possibility for a trade just because of how unorthodox it is. But they could absolutely roll in to the fall with this lineup. I think the only other thing that he talked about that jumped out at me was just the Raymond Insider conversation, and was asked about that directly, and pretty much said that they wanted to set aside money allotted for them, which we knew, but hearing it from his mouth, I think is certainly worth something. And then pretty much just said that they're still working on it, and it's not a matter of if, but when, and they fully plan on getting a deal done, in the summer, which is great. If that ends up being true, then great. It's really all I care about. But he called Raymond a star in the middle of in the presser as well. Clearly was not doing they're not really that good to lower the salary or anything. Clearly is not playing any games like that. Was pretty open about wanting to lock them up long term. So
yeah, absolutely. I think the last thing that I got really is, I guess I got 2 more quick things. They asked him about the goaltending situation too, because obviously they have 4 goalies on the roster, one of which we assume will be sent down to the AHL, but who knows? We've been wrong before. But talking about Talbot, Husso, and Lyon in particular, he said that Husso's been completely cleared to play, he's healthy, and that right as of right now, they're going to approach next season like they approached last season, where the 3 goalies are going to go to training camp and compete for the job, or the jobs, plural, and that last year they'll play it by ear and see what needs to be done. So basically, Yzerman was very clear that at the moment he doesn't have another move in the making, but also Yzerman's a liar. So
he also straight up said there could be another move. Like that.
He said he hasn't ruled it out.
Right. That's like that's what he said. He said like, oh yeah, like there could be another move. Well,
because again, you just look at this roster and the construction of it is so unorthodox. Like you move one or two players on the defense or one of these goalies, and all of a sudden, and you bring somebody else in via trade. Like all of a sudden, it makes a little bit more sense. But we won't know until it happens because they break their own news. So we'll just be sitting around for the next 2 weeks, making up crap to talk to you guys about, coming up with stuff off the top of our head to preview for next season, and then boom. Halfway through a recording, Yzerman's going to break a bombshell trade because that's what he likes to do.
His favorite thing.
Mm-hmm. He also says he does feel the pressure. He does feel a little bit of pressure, but he's not going to veer from his course. He's like, the pressure's not going to have him change how he is approaching this rebuild, which I like. Don't want him to get desperate and make a dumb move.
That's probably the answer you want to hear is like, yes, I understand there is pressure, but I also believe in the plan that I have in place. Right.
All right, Scotty, do you have any final thoughts? Anything else left to add?
I don't think so, man. No, it's again, like weirdly, a lot of information actually came out of this. Yeah. It wasn't just all GM speak, but also, like, did we really learn anything we didn't know before? Like,
it was more confirmation about things we were speculating on, which we honestly, like you said, rarely we get that.
For sure. Yeah. No, I think that's it, though. We ball.
We do ball. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow, probably rehashing the quote-unquote lost episode where we talk about, is this team truly any better? A little bit more in depth. So stay tuned for that. Same time, same place. Your team every day.